Morning, everybody. I'm super excited to welcome Barry Mainz from Forescout Technologies. Barry, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited. You have an incredible background. It's an amazing space, changing every day, especially due to AI and several other things. We'll talk about all of those. But before we get going, it'll be great if you would please take a couple of minutes, introduce yourself as well as your company.
Okay, sounds good. My name is Barry Mainz. I reside here in California, Napa, California. So been in the US for all my life. Grew up in San Francisco and spent the lion's share of my career in tech, although I spent a small portion of my time, first part of my career, in high-tech advertising, which was pretty interesting. But I'm super excited to have our conversation today, given all the changes that are happening, and certainly we can see some, fairly monumental changes around the corner with regard to cybersecurity.
Terrific. You want to say a little bit about Forescout?
Yeah, so Forescout's been around for 25 years and really took off about 12 years ago, 11 years ago when network access control became super important, right? To say, hey, I want to make sure that if someone wants to connect to a network, we're going to, make sure they can comply first. If they comply, then they connect. And that sort of skyrocketed into the public market. And then, about 5 years ago, went to the private market. We went for private equity. And I can tell you the one, I always kind of like to take a look at, are the secular trends aligned with the growth and some interesting things that could be happening to the company? And they absolutely are. The kind of introduction of, or the worrisome issues with IoT and OT devices has really catapulted our business up to not just a NAC company, but really a sort of network operations security center, and being able to go and provide for the largest companies, private and public, on the planet, to provide them network security. And the last I've been here about 3 years at Forescout, and it's been a great journey. And things are really moving in the right direction.
25 years is a long time, especially in tech and especially in cybersecurity. So, what made Forescout sort of stand out over the years, and what's so unique about your journey today?
Yeah, I think part of it is the corporate culture. There's one on where you're either getting better or getting worse. There's no staying the same. So that's embedded in the culture to continually change. I think we also feel it's okay that and I think what you're kind of pointing to, that most companies don't catch lightning in a bottle more than once. You catch it and then that 25 years. But I think we're onto something with our platform and with aligning with new secular trends, and with that culture about saying, hey, it's okay to change, it's okay to be wrong. Hey, if you're we don't need to be the smartest people in the room, it's the best learners. I mean, these kinds of corporate culture embedded into that, kind of cultural lock-in, I think has really helped us transition.
You've been at some amazing companies, Malwarebytes and other places, and you've been also on the capital side. So, when you look at attributes from an organizational perspective, culture is a very amorphous word, right? And in a fast-moving space like cybersecurity, and it's so diverse, it's global, things are happening everywhere, and nation states are involved. It's very, very complex. It's possibly one of the most complex area, and that's why it's growing so fast. So, what does the word culture mean to you? Like when you say culture?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question, because I think most companies, they always say that you got 6 months and you still have the new car smell, and you can kind of check what the culture is. But once you're in, you don't know, and you're just part of it. And I think it's how companies think about solving problems. It's about some of the routines or the underlying ways in which routines are created. Like, for example, is it okay to be a B plus plan better than an A plus plan? Sometimes people say, well, B plus plan's better if you have the ability to tweak and tune along the way, because you'll never get there with an A plus plan. And you see the velocity orientation. So I think it has to go with the routines, the morals, the kind of guiding principles. Go look at the guiding principles of a company, and you can see some of the things that align up with where that might be in terms of a description of the culture. So, I do feel like it's a blueprint of how a company might operate from a personal perspective and a cultural perspective. And I think, again, it's everything if you don't have the right culture set up for the next journey in your, in the kind of the whether it's technology or whatever industry is that next, kind of next big thing, or the focus on the next big thing.
And from the journey perspective, when it comes to Forescout, has the culture been evolutionary, or there are step changes it has gone through that were fundamentally very different from one period to another?
Yeah, I think that, I've only been here 3 years, so I can't speak to, what was around 20 years ago or so. But what I can say is that I'm one that believes that it's very, very hard to change culture, incredibly hard, but you can augment it. And you can get people rallied around certain things that will help create, capture, and deliver value. And if you're successful, that helps people move in that direction. And I'll give you an example. We have a kind of a very strong effort in spending time, the whole company executives, on where the money changes hands. Because if you're the further away you're from the money changes hands, and whether that's how the distributors and resellers work in that process, but taking the customer perspective and you don't get that, you probably miss a lot of stuff. You're going to be slower. You're not going to get the nuances. You're not going to get the wording right. And good Lord, there's nothing better than, a CFO getting assigned an account, and he's got to sit or she's got to sit and go through and understand, wow, we are really hard to do business with. But you're not going to get that perspective unless you get to see it from the eyes of the customer in that perspective. And that was one of the things that we got to see early off. Hey, maybe we needed to change some things and become easier to do business with. Were we losing deals because we weren't? And, sometimes just seeing it, kind of gives you a whole new world. So I just think that that's a key thing to making sure that you can augment your culture, and eventually over time that modifies and changes.
That's a great point to sort of build upon, is that, culture is one thing from within, but it's also how others perceive you, right? And it's more than just people attributes, it's process and technology and, all of the above. So when it comes to, going to market, are you predominantly partner based, or do you go direct, or what are your motions?
100% partner based.
And has it evolved over the years, or it has always been partner based?
Well, we do sell. Let me just give you a kind of a description a little bit about how we sell or what we sell, because it'll give you a little bit more. We sell about 10% of our business is hardware, right? It's a appliance that sits and the customer, in their premise. And just given export compliance and things like that, you're going to have to use distribution, right? There's no way I can have a appliance sitting in Saudi Arabia, right? So shipping it there, right? So we have partners, and Dell has locations, and they store under the building and all that stuff. So we have distribution. And then in addition to that, we have our resellers and some of the implementation resellers. So it's been 100%. It's very vital to us being successful and our customers being successful. So that's been one thing that's been very consistent over time. And I think with the advent recently, when I say recently, probably in the last 3 to 5 years with MSPs and MSSPs, that's been a little bit different partnership, but that's been one that's been really successful for us as well.
And how are you structured, Barry, from a go-to-market perspective? I mean, how is it? Do you have by verticals? Do you have by reseller types? Like, what is your go-to-market motion?
So a couple different things, and just to give you a size, so when I tell you what explain, you'll kind of understand. We'll end up pretty close to 400 million in revenue this year. So let's give you a size. We have an 1,100 employees, so just kind of the context. We have a couple different things. So for our Department of Defense, which and all of the federal and civilian business that we do, government business, that is very much a vertical, right? And there's a dedicated team that would handle that, plus NATO, plus some other things, right? So that would be vertical. I would like to say that we are set up to go to market vertically, but we have sales reps that would have specific accounts, tend to have specific accounts that, especially in the very large enterprises, that would align to those verticals. So for example, maybe in healthcare, I've got in a few regions reps that just focus on healthcare. So I would say that it's a combination of very large enterprise, some vertical alignment, and then down market to the strategics, it's more of a horizontal.
And when it comes to the other part of the ecosystem, for example, alliances or technology licensing, like what are those pieces in your ecosystem?
Yeah, so we've got disties, resellers, alliance partners, right? And so let's take like a Siemens or Yokogawa, where we're working, and they would be more very vertically oriented, save for OT, for example, very vertically oriented. And so we would, partner, and they would be part of the strategic sales play that we might have aligned for that. And also could have special integrations, could have engineering work to make sure that, our product looks like maybe more of an ODM or OEM relationship. So, we've got, and then we've also got just a standard, I've got a reseller and they work closely in the environment. So it kind of handles all. And we also have within the alliance partners, we have ones that we would sell with and others that we might sell through. So the cell width would be just, hey, we've got a strategic, maybe an integration, and then that works. And we have about 700 of those worldwide. And then on the ODM or OEM side, we've got about 25.
So when you were at Malwarebyte, which is 3 or 4 years ago, was the sort of the cybersecurity ecosystem roughly the same, or it has changed over the last 5 years or so?
No, so Malwarebytes was way down market. So, Malwarebytes was a combo platter, about 50-50. I ran both a consumer, where it was, uh, AOV of average order value of $39. And, so it was thousands of transactions a week, tens of thousands. And then on the other side, it was mostly down market. So I would say 1,000 employees and below, heavily MSP, work a lot with state, local government, and maybe the secure and mature kind of companies that didn't have quite the investment available to put a very sophisticated set of red blue teams and IT operations and that kind of stuff. So they were very different. I did learn there, which interesting is product led growth and how do you leverage the digital aspects of go to market that can actually provide a lot of demand gen and or experience and improve the experience. But at Forescout, we couldn't be more different. We are in, like I would say most of our business would be in the global 2000. So 3 out of the 5 Fortune 500 use our stuff. So it's both on the most, you know, public and private, very large implementations. Again, like I said, couldn't be more different than Malwarebytes. You asked a question about the actual security dynamics going on, which, I think there's some very similar things. And it's interesting. We started seeing them about 5 years ago. I'll give you another little thing. So I worked at Wind River, embedded operating system. And that embedded operating system sat in critical infrastructure type environments, industrial robots, drawbridges, planes, trains, automobiles, the power and utilities systems, right? And we saw back then that over time, and nothing was built in for patch and vulnerability, right? So you couldn't update it, or it was very hard. We also saw that those devices were being connected or being smart. We said, there's going to be an issue here in a few years as people start to realize this. Fast forward to Forescout, we quickly realized right when I started here, about 6 months in, we started realizing that embedded operating systems, one in particular, actually was exceeding in terms of CVEs than what would you call standard operating systems or IT operating systems. And it was critical infrastructure devices. We saw the critical infrastructure device issues coming up and breaches coming up. And they were moving at 1,000% every quarter up. So we knew there was, people were getting smart about, hey, we had to go change. And so that's a big difference is we didn't really think about as much the critical infrastructure, IoT, OT, or medical OT devices like we do today. And if you see a lot of the big breaches, whether it's with hospitals or some of the Vault Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, that's critical infrastructure. And, it's tough and scary because how do you go replace a whole airport, sort of campus with all the escalators, elevators, cameras, and everything? It's difficult to do. And so I think we're at a point where, there's some issues that we've got to be thinking about as a industry and certainly as a society, what we need to be working on to make sure we're safe.
So let's double click a little bit on manufacturing because you have a great background all the way going from Intel and here today, and it's a very large portion of the global economy. It's highly connected. Whether it's tariff or supply chain issues, it's getting more and more connected. I did a session with Jeff Winter on manufacturing 4.0, and he's from critical manufacturing. They do a lot of consulting and really drives through transformation. And one of the main things he brought up, which you started with, is culture, this constant culture of innovation and change, and you have to have a system level thinking. So can you I'm going to frame the question for you. So when you look at manufacturing as a segment, are there, especially when it comes to the cybersecurity stack, are there a cluster of players like you and others that have bundled solutions? Because no one security company can secure the entire manufacturing supply chain, right? So you have to classify at the topography level who are the players with you that would go and secure, let's say, industrial or textile. These different categories. Are there certain patterns that are emerging?
Yeah, I mean, an easy one is Siemens, right? They do basically power systems and they specialize in data centers. Now they do other stuff as well, but data centers. And why do we need data centers? Go look at a manufacturing plant and go look at where those manufacturing plants are. Oftentimes take a lot of power. They're 24/7. They need, low latency backup, and this kind of thing. So yeah, we would partner with a Siemens and we would make sure that for them, since they're providing a managed service in addition to just the hardware, that we would partner with them as a managed service provider, that they would use our solutions to help secure those particular manufacturing power systems, right? The power piece of that manufacturing supply chain. And that would be just one example. And the other one might be just, things like Hirschman. So Hirschman is going to do communications. And so that might be for transportation. And if you go look at manufacturing plants and have you been to like seen like Audi, how they manufacture and what they do? Have you
Not
been to
recently,
one?
but I've seen them on the web. Yes.
And it's very cool because they actually have a train that goes right through the manufacturing plant and picks up stuff to go and say, hey, I've got to go I'm going to go paint the cars in Czechoslovakia. So I'm going to go load them in Germany. And then they're going to go out as they go through the supply chain. They load the train up there. Well, there's a lot of security that has to happen when that train is in the plant because you could have some pretty serious issues given if you kind of take a look at how those are. So we work very close with Hirschman on the communication, on the platform, secure that communication channel between the manufacturing plant and that train itself. So we know what's going on, what's not going on, this kind of thing, and who might be affecting that train. Because once that train leaves, now that thing's full of a bunch of cars and equipment, and you want to make sure that you don't have that train going somewhere where you don't want it to go, for example. So lots of ways of working with our partner ecosystem to make sure we add value.
Are there certain parts of manufacturing sector where you see cybersecurity is growing much faster than the other sectors?
So, yeah. I mean, I think that automotive is one, right? So manufacturing with automotive. The other thing is when we talk about oil and gas, so oftentimes we don't think about that as manufacturing, but you got to go from, ground to, gas station or service station. There's a supply chain there and there's a lot of processing that has to go on. And it's looked at very much like a manufacturing plant, especially if you're at any of the locations where they're doing any of the processing of the petroleum. So that's growing fast, very fast because of the exposure to and the critical infrastructure of what that provides a society. So that's another one. I would also say just some of the rank and file stuff we didn't see before, like textile. You think that's kind of crazy, but those are massive, massive manufacturing plants, and there's a lot of work that's being done to make sure they secure those because they weren't before. So there's a kind of a green field. If you go look at where some of the breaches are happening, they're starting to happen in maybe the, sort of tangential industries aside from oil and gas, aside from automotive manufacturing, that kind of thing is starting to go like in textiles. So we start seeing textiles on the map here recently.
So when you kind of talk about, an Audi manufacturing line in a developed country, the partner ecosystem is quite mature, has been at play, versus when you go to an emerging country for textile manufacturing, the expertise and the distribution and the whole support network is not there, right? And emerging fast, but it's not necessarily there at the same level at a developed country. So from an organizational perspective, how do you provide coverage in sort of these two developed and developing economies?
Well, we have locations there, right? I mean, we have teams, and so if you go look at, the amount of sales teams that we have, they're in the largest GDP geos that are out there. I would almost argue that some of the immature markets are easier than the more mature ones. I think there's a lot of arrogance in the very mature ones. I think there is a lot of legacy, very, very complex, very, very legacy systems that have been running for 15, 20 years. There's lack of technical competency. You got IT and OT. Some industries they talk, or some companies they talk, some they don't. And it's almost when they're less mature, they're more open to, okay, what do we have to go do? It's like, doctor, I'm here, my leg hurts, help me. Versus, well, I think I know this, and you tend to have less egos. I mean, think about how some of the very most mature critical infrastructure systems, they're almost kind of
50,
frozen,
50,
right?
60 year old. Yeah.
Yeah, how do I go and update this thing? Who even knows where it goes? Is it a USB stick? Where's the prom? That kind of stuff. So I think both, but like I said before, this industry we might call OT or IoT, and I just talk about the category is is way more open to and thinking of what they need to do to go and secure those particular systems and devices than they were even 2 years ago. Way more. So, I think that's great. And I think we've seen, and unfortunately, it's kind of had to take some pretty brutal breaches before that's happened. And, good news is I think at least if you think about some of the governmental regulatory things like NIS2 or the Disclosure Act that happened a couple years back, where if you were a manufacturer, or you can be anybody, if you're a publicly traded large organization and you had a breach, you had to go and disclose not only IT devices, but OT and IoT devices, non-traditional devices. And if you didn't, CFO, COO, and president could be liable personally. So a lot of those regulatory things have driven a lot of the, okay, we got to open our eyes and think a little bit differently here too.
So, Barry, one thing, now that we have set the context for our audience, sort of the businesses you're in and the complexity you deal with, I wanted to kind of move into on the partner side of your business. Can you describe to a little bit about who your typical partners are, the sizes, the competencies that they have, and then we'll get into your organization side how you provide
Yeah.
coverage.
Yeah, most of them are, well, I would say all of them are specializing in some category of cybersecurity. So that could be the IoT, OT, cybersecurity, could be general like an Optiv where they have multiple divisions, most of verticals, or like a BT where they may focus on federal government, for example. But we work with the partners, and most of the time, if we don't have the right partner, we would, of course, go and talk to the customer and say, who do you work with? Who do you want to work with? But the ecosystem is fairly mature, so it's not difficult to find out, okay, which partners are working with which. Also, we deal with very, very large companies, so they tend to have a set of partners that they like to deal with. And we've been in business for a while, so we've got a pretty good sense of, okay, who's who in the zoo and where do we need to do that. And that would be either whether it's in our UAE territory, whether it's in the DACH region in Europe, whether it's in North America or whatever. And you mentioned before about, is it verticalized? Yeah, it is verticalized, especially if you're having a partner that would deal with, like, say, Southern Company and, with power and making sure that they need to know OT very well. You kind of have to have the right partner there. So we would have and do have specialized partners for specific verticals and specific use cases.
So, from a go-to-market, opportunity creation perspective, when you look at these sort of mature markets, you're saying they're predominantly brownfield. They have a lot of legacy infrastructure in place, including yours, because you've been around for 25 years. I'm sure they have systems in place. Versus when you look at these developing countries or greenfield opportunities, do the sales motion, marketing motions vary on the partner side and your side? How do you go to market there?
They do. I mean, like I said, the emerging markets, and maybe I'll say emerging market might be like Meta, right? The Middle East. And but they see the risk. Sometimes it's a little bit easier because they don't have all of the cultural lock-in that they might have because they did something for so long a certain way. So that's been a super successful region for us. India as well, and where they know the issues and they seem to be, like you said, maybe merging, so maybe less mature in certain of the ecosystem. So you don't have that lock-in where, oh, I've had four partners, and if you want to buy, you got to go through those four partners. That's it, right? And that's not the case in many there. And I think it's been a pleasure to uh, learn with those emerging markets, then trying to say, here's how you have to go do it. And it's been great. And those, like I said, India and Meta are two of our fastest growing regions in the world, and they're emerging. So it also helps. We have a combination on our product, and we're ambidextrous. We have on-prem because we have sort of air gapped environments, and where people have, hey, I've got a kind of a data center and I need this, let's say if it's a bank or what have you, and cloud. So we can do either or. And that's been very useful to go into some of these emerging markets where they're like, you know what, I'm going to do my colo in an on-prem, and then maybe I'll move to the cloud later, right? And so we can help them either way. And that's been really useful because we can take them on their journey, the buyer journey, as they move along. And being able to do on-prem, and it's not a bad word anymore. If you would have asked me 5 years ago, I'll ask you another thing. So we have a lot of our partners, and we had a partner event, and this topic came up. It's interesting, just given the cost and the CapEx OpEx trade-off when you're a very large company using whether it's AWS or Azure or whatever, it's starting to get to a point now where, hey, I might have to balance a little more colo because it's cheaper to be on-prem for this kind of a thing than it would be cloud. So I do see some of the repatriation happening, which I never thought would happen. If you would have asked me before, I would have said, so that's good for us because we can do both. And then we also have the ability to go to some, like I said, the emerging markets where maybe they were on-prem and they want to move to the cloud. We can help them either way. So thought that was an interesting point that, especially in the last 6, 7 months, started to see.
So, staying on the sort of the emerging and developing developed economies and brownfield and greenfield, you are one of those execs that had a stint at a distribution, right? TD Synnex. I did a podcast with Anthony Graziano last week. They're heavily focused in SMB. But when you look at from an overall distribution landscape, cybersecurity kind of grew on the back of specialty distributors, lots of them in every region, right? And then the broadliners came in and started to pick them up to build specialty distribution, right, at a higher margin, IRR, because security was subscription versus just selling hardware.
Look at WWT, for example. It's a great example.
Exactly. So things change. So can you talk to us a little bit from a global landscape perspective? How is distribution changing on the back of cloud and cybersecurity?
Well, they got to figure out how they can add value. So one thing, of course, if you have hardware, hey, having hardware and all of the export compliance stuff that you're not shipping from one location like you would if you were manufacturing here, they handle that. So the distribution aspect of a distributor, that's one that's very good. I think the other piece that they've been helpful is some have specialized professional services. So they will come, they will have dedicated and certified Forescout service professionals, and they'll work closely with the resellers as they're building that reseller channel to make sure that those resellers can continue to add value. Some provide support. Here's another thing: it's like they'll provide tier one, tier zero, tier one support in those regions, and it's great, right? They can help 24/7. They have that set up, and they'll provide for customers and the partner. So that's another value add that we didn't see before. I mean, it was actually, Sugata, it was Compact Microelectronics that changed to Synnex because of the lawsuit between Compact Computers and Compact Microelectronics. So they just changed their name and went through. But we didn't have professional services, and that's, I won't say relatively new, but probably in the last 10 years that's evolved so that there could be a value proposition towards working closely with them. And then maybe last but not least, another one would be, do they give you access and guidance on what are the key partners that have, maybe the right go to market, the right employees, the right people. They can actually be a good thought partner for you to make sure you set up the right go to market, especially in the emerging areas, for example.
Yeah, and some of the distributors, regionally and locally, they also bought up MSPs to build that back and knock
Yeah.
and SOC and capabilities. I want to move into metrics because the world where security started, mostly gateway products and some endpoint products, it was a hardware world. And today it's predominantly, you said your business is 10% hardware and 90% software. So as a C-level exec, can you talk to us a little bit about how the board has started to look metrics differently? How did they look at metrics about 10 years ago? And what do they look at now?
Well, I think we were not a subscription company before. So, we looked at dollars differently, right? You had, annual, we didn't look at reoccurring revenue, for example, right? We looked at ACV, annual contract value, or TCV, total contract value. And you looked at the maintenance piece that might be recurring, but the other piece was non recurring. And so now we look at obviously ARR, and we look at GDR, gross retention dollars, or gross retention, two huge metrics. And you'll see most software companies, orientating themselves around ARR, GDR, and maybe something around contract length and timing. But those are the key metrics. Now there's a lot of other metrics. But, in 10, 15 years ago, you didn't look at that, right? You looked at maybe new bookings, and you looked at, your retention rate, and, maybe you would look at total contract value and these things, which we tend to look, ACV. We tend to look less at ACV now. I mean, you have it there, but it's like, we care about other metrics more. Like I said,
So most channel organization that were hardware centric, in there are few metrics where coverage, sales out per rep, or work in process, RMAs, and all those sort of traditional stuff, right? Are they still there, or they're sort of the second and third layer, primary layers are more tied to recurring revenues?
well, like I said before, we sell an appliance. It works great, but it's a smaller portion of our business. Yeah, we look at RMAs. Yeah, we look at all this stuff that you just talked about. Just less important. We really care about. And if you look at how hardware is, if you take a value of a hardware box, we used to say everything was hardware, and maybe you would have a maintenance fee. Well, now most companies will say there's a hardware aspect, but then there's a big fee that's a technology access fee that's reoccurring, because most of the customers will have a 5 year, call it, before they have to asset refresh. And so we just look at the structure of the dollars differently than we used to do. Yeah, people care about RMA ratios and stuff like that, but I would suspect if our revenue was a lot higher on hardware, it might be more, kind of front and center. But I also think the supply chains are better, and the reliabilities are better. Mean time between failures are better. RMA levels are better, way better, especially on appliance boxes and things that maybe were higher before. I mean, I remember even 20 years ago, RMA levels were pretty high for certain kinds of hardware, and they're quite a bit lower now. I think just the ability to deal with the heat, you can just see Intel processors. I mean, if you remember those first laptops, if you had an Intel based laptop and it was sitting on your lap in an airplane, it would burn your trousers. And just dealing with the heat issue that they used to, they don't deal with that really as much anymore. So I think that we're in a much better space, and that suggests that it's not important. It's just not as kind of necessary in terms of key metrics to run the business.
So, what does your dashboard look like? What do you have in your desktop? What do you have in your mobile? Like, how do you keep track of the business?
Few things, right? I mean, we look at our revenue, we look at our GDR, we look at our CSAT and our NPS scores. Super important. There's some other financial metrics that we have that are important, like pipeline percentage coverage, and where we're at with the quarter. Those are things we have a dashboard on. I think it's also really important. I like to take a look at some of the sales metrics in terms of productivity. So we have dashboards in around that, like what are the maybe some of the call volumes or appointment volumes. Can we is that usually a good indicator? Because oftentimes when the sales team sneeze, the company catches a cold 9 months later. So those could be early indicators on things. We have some key metrics in and around engineering, delivery, burn down of defects, things in and around shrink to fit. So did you deliver that product without having to take a bunch of features out? And I'm sure we all lived in it, where it's like, hey, we delivered the product. Yeah, but you got all these late binding features. You got 30 things that didn't show up, but we still had our number. We've got some metrics in and around that, because I think that's important to really understand, hey, how well are we in around making those? And then we've got a bunch of things in and around the forecast.
What about partner centric metrics? Are there specific things that you look at on the partner side?
We have some alliance partner things that are pretty big lift partners. So, at my level, I don't look at partner like resellers or disties. That's part of our pipeline, and we'll do that over the forecast. But we do look at some of the big lift partners like Microsoft, Arista. Like, what are they driving to us? Because they're Siemens are very strategic, and they have a ability. There's work that we're still working with them. There's some executive stuff, so we do look at that, but not at the reseller perspective. That just goes into the go to market. I mean, not maybe a component of demand gen or partner driven leads, that kind of stuff.
Speaking of metrics, one of the three-letter word is ROI, and with your capital background, one question I wanted to ask you, at your level, looking at everything that's going on around AI, how do you measure the investment criteria, what you put in your product, as well as what you're putting in your business?
That's a loaded question, because that everyone's asking that. I know that Benioff, came up with that comment. We said, oh, we were able to lay off, and I heard 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people. I think the real number is 7,000 by implementing AI. And look, I was born at night, but not last night. That's I don't believe that's the case. If it took you AI to figure that out, you probably have a bunch of executives that should be fired because that's crazy. But we have an initiative right now, which is to look at a combo platter of things, both internal usage of AI and how productive we really are with it. Hey, if Chat GPT helps you write an email, I'm just giving it, Copilot or whatever. Like, how do you figure that out? And we're working through that. I don't know, have the right answer for that. We have lots of tools in marketing. The good one is, some of the stuff on translation or, kind of translating a website. Because as I don't know if, have a second language, but, I do. And how Google Translate may say something in Spanish is not the way that oftentimes you would really say it, but the AI translation is pretty good. So, and it helps, right? Because it's like if you got something in Japanese, for example, they can rip through it quickly and get it done. So that kind of stuff we're starting to measure. Okay, so that's kind of call it internal. Where we're working a lot on is product. So we have an initiative where right now AI creates reports, and it was reports for the folks in the SOC and to say, hey, where should you focus? What are the things, the events that need attention now? How does that work? And we could actually add control and we could do things, but we're playing around with that. That seems to be really good because people can say, hey, give me my report for the audit committee. Boom. And it comes up in nice format and put in PowerPoint. So some of those things as utilities are working on trying to figure out how much is that really helping? And then there's some pieces that are actually in the product that are helping, like with configuration, orientation, this kind of stuff. We're still trying to get the right, hey, how much more productive? So stay tuned. I think I'm not unlike many other CEOs that, I'm a idealist and a practical idealist. So, hey, I think it's going to help us a lot. We're still trying to say, hey, what's that number? If it's 5, 10% now, great. But like, what is it really going to be? So stay tuned.
So has the board dialogue changed on AI related investment? Because you're on multiple boards. Like when you think about, your peer group 18 months ago or 24 months ago, how people were excited about AI or the board was asking, CEOs to do. Has that changed?
No, I think that, we're still maybe the wanting to say, okay, great, the hype is still the hype. Hey, are you give us some real facts on some things, and we're able to produce them or show them some of the technology that we have. I do feel like just in the go to market side, and I mentioned at the beginning that we spend time close to where the money changes hands. Me too, and I can tell you that there's just in the sales cycle, there's in a checklist for some of the before they sign off or when they brew it to the CFO, there's an AI checkbox that says, hey, are they utilizing AI, and maybe a little brief description how. So we're starting to see that come up in the sales cycle from with customers. But as far as the board, yeah, I think we talk about it. We've got some, wonderful, Advent and Crosspoint have a lot of Portco companies or Portcos, and that there is a lot of effort in and around, hey, how do we learn from each other? And what are some things that we might be able to do differently? And that's fairly active. And I think that's moving in the right direction, whether it's how we use it internally for IT, or whether it's, hey, can we game board some things on engineering or product development?
There's been a lot written over the last 6 months, shortage of talent in AI, right? Real sort of hardcore AI ML talent. At your level, are you seeing that, or is it easy to hire, hard to hire?
No, it's it feels kind of like the days of two hops, one from packaged app or from custom apps to packaged apps. And what do you do? I think that this time where they had the CIO used to stand for career is over. People moving from their custom app to SAP R3 or Oracle, right? That was tough. But finding the right people that could help you with that journey was difficult. Then we had the web, transition, really hard. And then we talk about cybersecurity when it used to just be endpoint, and now it's way different than that. And I think we're going to the new thing, which is to say, okay, now you have your security team and your security strategy. How do you, and where because AI can hurt you too if you don't deploy it correctly, right? There's hallucinations. There's things like, for us, we still don't let it do control. Like we would not block for HSBC their networks via the AI agent. Just we're still working through that, right? So I do feel like there's a sense of it's important. We don't have the talent because it's still changing around the language models, which language model, which system do you use, which has worked. I think we just need some experiences too to be able to do it. So even if you have the talent, is it the right talent? So I think we struggle with the rest. We do a lot of training and things like that, but there's, I think, a lack of maturity, and that has to continue with the curve of, maturity plus talent equals value. So I think that we're kind of along that journey.
Amazing. I have three quick lightning round questions. So
Okay. Lightning questions. Okay.
yeah, let's see what your thoughts are. So one security myth you wish people would stop believing.
I think one security myth that, IoT and OT doesn't matter when we talk about it on the campus. Oh, I don't need to worry about that. You still hear that. That's a
That's a
myth.
big one.
You need to worry about it.
Second one, the next big bet in cybersecurity.
I think, if you don't think about it now and you think about what it could do for the bad actors, it puts power in the bad actors' hands. And the ability, whether it's encryption, right, being able to go and say, hey, I got post quantum encryption problem, which unfortunately, if you're not thinking about that, that's just an easy one. I can unencrypt a whole bunch of stuff and have access within seconds. So I think, quantum computing, and the other one be agentic AI.
Your favorite book from the past that you think would be highly relevant in the future.
Oh, there's a couple of them. I like Never Split the Difference by Voss. He was an FBI negotiator, and I think that, you negotiate in your life the whole time. And, this whole notion that I learned when I was a bartender and a waiter, through college. And one of the things that, kind of came out of that, I sort of thought of, do you want to be right or rich? And it's like, you need to choose at some point, because, having the customer lose and you win is not a good one. So I think that's actually a really good book. I think that'll have legs as well, because I think it starts to think about, I don't know if you've read that book. It's amazing. Some really good stories and some pretty interesting things, but that's a good one from a business perspective. The other one would be a lean startup, although I think the lean startup 2 is similar. And I don't think it's, MVP, but it would be more of the, instead of minimum viable, it's minimum usable. So I think there's some tweaks and tunes. And I know that, um, that Eric Ries has changed. I know Eric, so Eric Ries is changing kind of that thought a bit. But I think that those 2 books, have legs, and people find them interesting in terms of business books. There's a lot of other ones that are out there, but I just finished Foss's book, so that's top of mind.
That's amazing. Well, Barry, thank you so much for being here. I would love to have you back in 6 months and follow up on some of these conversations. But thank you for being here.
Yeah, and thanks for great questions. And your questions, the lightning questions, some of those are harder because they made you think for a bit, saying, I got to have one. But really good questions, and thanks for having me.
You're welcome.